Hey, I'm Alex Radical from Board Game Co, and today I'm doing a rapid-fire review of Hood, Troubles in Sherwood, A Fun Phalanx. This is a prototype, all rules and components subject to change, and I'll have a link to the crowdfunding campaign down below. And my rapid-fire reviews are a format where I try to give you a brief overview of the game, as well as my thoughts and opinions in 10 minutes or less. Sometimes I make it, sometimes I don't. With that said, Hood is basically an asymmetric game of playing through a variety of factions. You can play as Robin Hood, you can play as Sheriff of Nottingham, you can play as the French nobility over here, or you can play as the Bishop of Hereford, as you take control of the factions, trying to gain victory points while doing mostly the same general structure, but having their own distinct aspects of how they're going to operate and play. To that end, the general idea, there's a lot of different aspects to go through. I'm trying to do a brief overview. The general idea is you have 3 actions per turn. Each faction has their own handy-dandy little player over here. You have specific actions you can do. You're going to take 3 actions per turn. Then you have the specific enhancement actions they can do. You have their ransom phase where you're trying to rescue King Richard while also trying to contribute towards that and gaining various perks for doing so. Then you have your income where you're going to draw fate cards over here and possibly discard down to 5, or always discard down to 5. And then finally you have the King Richard phase. But with that said, the general actions you can take, let's say for example, I'm going to go through Robin Hood and then talk through the nuances because they actually have from least to most over here. Robin Hood is mostly going to operate by trying to move around the board, rob from the merchants, which I find an interesting choice because the merchants feel kind of neutral and Robin Hood's robbing from the merchants. But if we pretend the merchants are evil, we have 2 merchants who are going to be making their way along the paths as players interact with them. But Robin Hood can rob from the merchants, they can move around the board, and they can trade, and then their specific action that makes them interesting is they give to the poor. They give money to the poor, allowing them to move their marker along their track, putting various camps onto the board, and then having various upgrades. For example, this one over here, this one's going to be, you get +1 combat, you get +1 strength whenever you have a combat near a camp. So they're trying to interact, gain money, fight the various baddies, they get points for they get points for the strength of the baddies they take out, and then they're trying to give to the poor and build up their tableau that way. Meanwhile, the Sheriff of Nottingham over here, they're slightly better at getting people onto the board, and they're issuing decrees. So they're better at getting the troops out onto the table, and they're going to be trying to issue decrees by having various notices in different areas, trading in those notices, and then putting decrees into play that will help upgrade their tableau. So they're a little bit more brute strength as you'd expect, but they're more about just getting out their units, trying to issue things that change the flow of battle as they play through it. We have the Bishop of Hereford over here. They're going to be building these buildings. Now, they're going to be sort of capturing the opposing units. They're doing so with sermons over here, but they're going to basically be rounding up opposing units and then trading in those units to an extent, although don't worry, the people will get fate cards as compensation, and they're trading in those units to go ahead and build buildings while scoring victory points on their own personal board as well. So that's their own little mini game that they're playing. And then finally, we have the French nobility, which they have an interesting aspect to them because they don't actually engage in combat the same way the others do. Instead, they engage in duels. So they don't have traditional combat. Rather, they have one-on-one duels with their stronger knights, which feels a little unfair, but it works for them as they play through it. And they're going to be trying to place out forts in the game. Placing out forts are going to allow them to get various ability tiles, similar to Robin Hood and their ability tiles, while also gaining various titles as well, trading in to gain various titles at the same time. So each of the factions kind of have their own little mini puzzle. They're operating in a similar way. They have similar arcs to the structure of the game. They all have 3 actions in the action phase, and the actions they choose are going to be slightly different, as well as the development phase and the special actions they have as far as, placing out a title, placing out a decree, getting a new title as the French, or building a fort, giving to the poor. All of those things are going to be slightly different faction to faction as they lean into what they do best. You're all trying to do this while trying to work your way up to the 25 victory points that will trigger endgame, while trying to interact with other players and lean into your competitive advantages slightly better than the other players. Which brings me to my rapid fire review with the first question: am I keeping this game? I don't think I am, but definitely hear out the parts as to the reasons why, because I don't actually have a lot of criticisms. This was a lot of fun. We'll get into the, well, let's do the why or why not. Why or why not? Well, ultimately, I think that this does fall into a very similar space that Root falls into. It is very different. There's a lot of reasons to consider this over Root, but for me, I do find that asymmetric faction games, and this is a game you could play with fewer than 3 players. It is going to be best at 4 players as far as the interaction of the factions. It definitely does work at lower player counts, but I think 4 is going to be the sweet spot, and that's true of games like Root as well. That kind of arc as far as the different factions playing off each other. I will say, by the way, there are, well, let's talk about that actually in the counter reasons. As far as the reasons why not, ultimately the main complaint I have is that this falls into a very similar space as Root, and I think I just prefer Root, or even possibly just might be more familiar with it at this point. And so to that end, I just don't think I would pull this out and play it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a great game. I have very, very few complaints. Like, sure, there's a bit of randomness in combat, but other than that, other than the randomness in combat, other than the fact that it's a drop less depth than Root, or maybe not a drop less, there's definitely less depth to it than Root, I find that there's no real complaints. I had a fun time with it. I just don't think it would see the table time it deserves, and I try to be very critical about what I hold on to, especially when there's comparable games I would rather play in its place. That's the biggest critique I have of the game. As far as other game recommendations, well, I mean, I think inherently at this point, this is a good time to recommend Root if you are interested in what Hood is doing well. I think Root is doing a similar thing. Hood is almost certainly inspired to some extent by that, which is not a bad thing. It's good to have more asymmetric games in the space, but definitely check out Root if you are interested in that kind of vibe. And if you're just here for the Robin Hood vibes, check out the Robin Hood, oh my gosh, what's it called? The Adventures of Robin Hood. The Adventures of Robin Hood from Cosmos, if you're just interested in the Robin Hood vibes, but I'm interested in more of a story, I think that carries you nicely through the story of Robin Hood. As far as a counter opinion, why you might want to consider this. Honestly, I kind of covered it in the reasons why I'm not keeping it. I have very few complaints on this game. It works really well. The art is incredibly charming and accessible. I love the presentation overall. I think the player boards, the styling, everything is great. I think it is more accessible than Root. If you dive into Root, each faction really takes a lot more depth to understand. Once you understand the basic flow of the way this game works, each faction has a minor distinguishing aspect between it, all covered in these player aids that really cover everything you need to know faction by faction as far as the differences between them. It is much more accessible than Root. It's an easy way to dive into asymmetric games, possibly one of the most accessible asymmetric games that doesn't feel like a gateway game, if that makes sense, and that is a good thing because it does that while not compromising on the strategy. The overall factions each have an area of tableau building. I love tableau building. I like it because all factions have something that makes them stronger as they play through it. That's a fun aspect. The fate cards over here, these lend themselves to lots of fun little abilities. They also interact with combat. That was part of the luck aspect. Again, there is some luck in the game and the combat, which luck is not the end of the world, but that's the only real critique I have of it gameplay-wise. But other than that, the cards are a ton of fun. Oh, I forgot to mention that Robin has their own deck of cards as well, by the way. Side points, I'm not getting too into things. But the Fate cards are a lot of fun. The interaction between the players, overall, it's very satisfying to watch the board play out. It does so all in a reasonable time frame. For the most part, I think there's a lot of good things to like here. Again, my only real critique is just the acknowledgement that I'm trying to be more critical about what games I keep because I can only hold on to so many games, and I think this is falling into the same space that I have for Root, which just makes me think that I would probably prioritize that one. But this was a fun time to play through. The interaction is very solid, and the tableau building between all the factions is very strong, and I don't think, at least in my play so far, I haven't seen a clear strength difference between one faction or the other. I will say, like many games of this type, there is a certain amount of the players balancing the game. That certainly will happen, which can impact, like, maybe it happens to be that the Sheriff of Nottingham is a bit stronger, and I just haven't noticed that because the players are balancing the game. But if you have a good group of players, that tends to work out well overall. As far as final thoughts and rating on this one, I'm going to give Hood a 4 out of 5. I like this game. This is fun to play through. It is a beautiful art, easy to table, easy to learn. The rulebook is very straightforward. The factions are very straightforward. All of it was a very accessible, easy to dive into game. And the only critique I have is just, again, other comparable games. So a 4 out of 5. Feel free to check out the campaign. I'll have a link down below. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this helpful, and as always, I hope you have a good one.